Thank you. It's an honor for me to be here. I'm an alumni for the Ronald Coase Institute. I went there in 2001, one of the first, I guess, institutes in Rio. And after that, like a year or 2 years after, I started to be a faculty, and I've been engaged until this year, twice this year. I got to meet Professor Coase twice in Chicago, and both times where I have very good conversations with him. The last one was during the conference for his 100-year celebration, where I presented a paper. And he came for lunch and just happened to be in the same table, and we have a very nice conversation. So let me, what I'm going to talk today is the less Coasean paper of the conference, so I apologize for that. And it's not going to be very applied either, so that's also I need to excuse. The only excuse I have is I was invited to present this paper, so I hope that there's a good reason for that. This paper, I've been thinking about these issues for a while, but you know, I never know how to do the paper in the sense that I do a lot of applied work, and it didn't seem that there was a way to do it econometrically. Also, I guess because I didn't have a very clear idea of what were exactly the hypothesis. So like a year ago, I started more systematically to look at some case studies and then to collect some systematic data. But finally, I end up, once I look the data, I end up mostly writing a model where help me sort of organize the ideas I have. That's basically where I am with this. And in a way, what I'm doing is revisiting a literature that was very popular like 15 years ago, which was the literature on the political economy of reform, but from the lessons that I think we have now. And essentially, in the political economy of reforms, there are different papers, but all are around the conflict between two coalitions, one that is pro-reform, that one is against reforms. Obviously, the reform is going to create a net surplus for society, but the losers oppose somehow, and there is transaction costs, they cannot be paid, and so reforms are delayed or do not occur. But after 20 years of reform, there's something new that I want to capture here, which is the fact that many times reforms are adopted and then are reverted, okay? And that seems to be very costly for society. And if you now think in terms of a modeling, you have to go back to the literature and revisit that, because the probability that the reform is reversed has to be taken into account also at the time of adopting the reform. So that's one thing that we are doing here, is to really write a fully Markovian dynamic model of the political economy of reform. But the second thing that strikes me as not taken into account back then, and important at the time of reform, but also at the time of the possibility of a reversal of a reform, is the role of external organizations. And the reason, well, there's many reasons you may want to think about external organizations as playing a possible role, but for example, as Phil was saying, I am at the IDB and I have a lot of money to pay the losers, right? At least that's what he said. So potentially they can affect the game once they enter in the game. But think about, for example, this that really interested me a lot, and I studied quite a bit, which is the difference between Argentina and Greece. In the sense, Argentina in the 90s did a really large number of structural reforms, and also peg its exchange rate to the dollar by law. So, but then it has a real shock, right, as opposed to the nominal shocks that used to have in the 80s. It has a real shock, and after GDP went down 15 to 20%, they abandoned the currency peg, and after that, they gradually reverted most of the reforms they did in the 90s, okay? Instead, Greece, did all the reforms that were needed to enter the euro, or at least they cooked the books, so to show that they were into the reform path. They also got a negative shock. GDP went down even more than in Argentina, but they are still in the euro. I don't know what's going to happen in the future, but essentially a government was elected under the promise that they're going to end the austerity, they're going to maybe quit the euro, and they didn't do it, right? They're still negotiating with euro authorities to remain within the euro. So what are two key differences between Greece and Argentina? One is that the cost of exit for Greece are much higher. Although the costs in Argentina were not low, the costs in Greece are much higher because they have given up some institutional capabilities that will make the transition much more costly. The other big difference is that the Eurozone is providing aid during the crisis. So you may think of that as an organization that is contributing to stop the reversion of some of the reforms. So in a way, now I'm going to think through the process with the help of a model. And although some of the things that I may end up saying with the model, after I tell you those, you will say, well, those were kind of trivial, or I could have thought about that. One nice thing about the model is that allows me to do welfare analysis and allows me to think about different types of the way in which these external organizations could intervene in the countries to improve welfare there, okay? So let me move ahead. I have only 5 minutes left. Okay, so you see, this kind of, I have more data, but for this short presentation, I'm going to focus on 3 cases. So this, for example, is an index of reform that was originally done by the IMF, and I extended to countries where they haven't done the index. And so, for example, this is Argentina. You see a lot of reform and reversal. You see that in Argentina there is reversal in many of the areas. In utilities, they don't capture reversal in Argentina because they only measure ownership. But I can tell you that by studying the case in detail, the reversal in a more meaningful way is complete because essentially the government froze all the tariffs for 10 years, all the utilities are losing money, and they are all subsidized by the government, which spend like more than 6% of GDP paying these subsidies, right? So the index are, as always with index, capturing some aspects, but not everything. Well, if you look at Brazil seems to, compared to Argentina, if you look the 90s, was clearly doing fewer reforms or reforms with less intensity, but they never sort of revert the reforms they did. Well, then, if you look at Eastern Europe, they end up at sometimes reforming even more than Argentina, and sometimes less, but they never reverted, okay? So in here you have 3 cases that I would like to capture as equilibriums, or potential equilibriums of a model. Ones where essentially without much of a foreign organization, you may go to an equilibrium with low reform that may be reverted or not. Or with the in participation of foreign organizations, we could go to a situation where there's huge amount of reform, but then there is huge reversal, or there is reforms that are not reverted. Okay, so there's several different cases, what I want to see if I can say something about each case that illuminates policy and welfare. Okay. So I think part of this I say, but I have in mind kind of the IDB, World Bank, IMF type of organizations, or the European Union. One thing that's going to be, and as I say, this surprisingly to me was not considered even in the early literature of the political economy of reform. So one thing that is going to be key is the time horizon of the foreign agents, right? So you may think that there are ways to deal that are transient or permanent. So in a transient way, you kind of sort of say, oh, I give you sort of help for the reform. As Phil say, we can help you to pay the losers today, but then you are on your own. And what's going to happen dynamically is that there's going to be an open opportunity for those that oppose reform maybe 10 years ago now to get to the power and have the possibility to revert the reform. And at that point, the foreign organization is not playing any role. Well, if you engage in a permanent way, essentially you can also help reforms, and also you can help the country not to revert the reforms. Obviously, for the exercise to have some meaning, you want kind of the present value to be the same. Right, so then if you engage in a permanent way, we are going to see a lower engage at the beginning, so some of the resources are safe for the future, okay? So what's the model set up? Okay, try to do this in 1 minute. So like in all those models, there's going to be a pro-reform coalition. Those are the ones that gain. There is an anti-reform coalition. Those are the ones that loses and oppose. And somehow this coalition cannot paint this coalition, and the reform may not occur, or the degree of reform will be lower than the optimal. There's a foreign agent. They, in principle, are interested in promoting reforms, and they can compensate this coalition. And so we have, as I say, a Markovian dynamic model where, with some probability, the anti-reform coalition might, in the future, be in the situation to decide policy and revert it. Okay. So there's going to be like an equilibrium without foreign agents, and there we predict modest reform and reversal depending on cost. And then equilibrium with foreign agents, one possibility is ambitious reform, but more likely to be reversed. This is interesting. So if an agents, like I think happened in the 90s, really go and promote ambitious reform, and then the engagement with the countries is transient, is more likely to see reversals. Because once the anti-reform coalition is in power, they will gain more for reverting the reforms if the reforms have taken a large degree than if it's really a small reform, given some fixed cost of reverting reforms. Okay, so this is tricky. And I think it was not part of the literature, that essentially in a country where the probability of getting in a situation where the anti-reform coalition is high, and the probability hence of a reversal is high, you may not want to go ambitious on the reform agenda, because that is going to stimulate the reversal of the reforms. So here is the trade-off between how much reform F pushes and the chances of reversal of the reform. Okay, so I have 0 minutes, so this is all about the static comparatives. Maybe I talk later if questions came with this. So then I was saying I'm going to talk a bit about welfare. So from the foreign agency, they have to choose on whether they go for the maximum non-reversal compatible reform, which I think is the desirable one, or whether they go for the maximal possible reform with the risk of high reversals. So a welfare maximizing but politically myopic foreign agency can induce too much reform and hence reversals, and it's my view that something like that happened. Okay. But then I have this extension in the model where there's 2 types of foreign agency interventions. Ones provide funds to reforms, and the others provide funds to avoid reversals. And what's interesting here is that countries prone to reversals, like Greece, welfare may be higher with low funds to reform, but high funds to defend the reform. Okay? Because essentially, if the probability of reversal is high, because there is a state of nature when the coalition that is, let's say, populist coalitions in Latin America are likely to come back to government, then you may say, oh, I have a window of opportunity like happened in the 90s. Let's reform everything. But if that's not politically sustainable, then what's going to happen is a huge reversal, as we see in many Latin American countries. Instead, if you do a much reasonable amount of reform that can be defended later, you are more likely to sustain the reforms. Okay, and that's basically another message of the paper. I'm going to stop here because I passed time. Okay.